This week, we're going to learn why it might not be such a good idea to try and sell to everyone. Michael has some leadership tips, and we'll talk about more about IoT startups. All that and more, so stay tuned. This is a Security Weekly production. This week on Startup Security Weekly, we're going to talk about security for startups, startups for security, security startups, security for non-startups. I don't know, something like that, but it'll be awesome, trust me. We got several news stories to talk about, including some very interesting tips from successful entrepreneurs, all that and more. So stay tuned. Oh, I thought you were going to play the new thing. Oh. Okay. Take two. Oh, okay. How about this? Just clip that out. Ready? Welcome to Startup Security Weekly, Episode 3. I'm your host, Paul Asadorian, broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. On the lines via Skype is none other than Mr. Michael Santarcangelo. Michael, welcome to the show.
It's always good to be with you, Paul.
I had to have a Bloody Mary in order to say that correctly, of course. So.
And it's good to see that it still works.
Yes, it does in fact work. But we're going to talk about what works for startups with respects to security. Michael, you wanted to start it off talking about what's the one thing that startups need to do relative to security? And I'm going to answer your question with a question. Do you mean their product security or the security of their company or both?
Yeah, to me, it's a both because what starts to happen is we say security is important, and everybody goes, "Oh yeah, it's really important." So I got thinking about it because you'll see too. There's the follow up. One of the follow ups that I have is who do you put where? Who handles what? How do you want to do those different pieces to it? So if you're a security company, does that raise the bar? What do you need to do? Where do you start? But let's say you're not. Let's say you're a startup. And you're bought in. Okay, I'm a tech startup. I'm an Internet of Things startup. You categorize yourself however you want. What do you do?
And by way of comparison, right, we used to say to people, well, you need to start with the risk assessment and then you need to have policies.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's the first place I'd start.
No, I wouldn't. And I think whether you're looking at, if you're a technology, let's just say technology startup, you want to look at your infrastructure in your building blocks, so to speak, whether you're looking at your product security or whether you're looking at the security of your organization itself. And by building blocks, I mean, do things right from the get-go. And I know that can be very difficult for a startup, right? It's a race to market. But make sure you're building a good foundation because, it's a really cliche analogy, right? But your house of cards is going to fall if it's not built on a solid foundation. And I think people think security, especially that it relates to a technology startup, well, security is, I got a firewall and we've got some antivirus and, with coding practices, we got this fancy tool that helps me not build in cross-site scripting and SQL injection. That's not security, right? Security is building the infrastructure and the processes with some kind of vision in mind. And I think if you do that, security is just a natural progression because much of security is about integrity. And if you're building that in from the start, you're already light years ahead of people who aren't thinking that way in terms of what they're building.
Yeah, I'm starting to come to this understanding as we ask more questions, right? And we've talked a couple times, and we're going to keep talking about this notion of minimal viable security. But I actually think it starts by just saying, as a startup, this is my simplest advice. Have a meeting. Give it a time limit. Give it an hour, give it 2 hours. If you want to go out to lunch and do it or do it in the afternoon and have a couple drinks, it's just ask the question and just say, what are we concerned about? But here's the thing, and Paul, maybe tell me how you would handle this, even in given the fact that you've been in this space as long as I have. You're a security startup. If you go do this, who are you going to validate against? And then if you're not a security startup, how would you figure out who to say, hey, I've talked it over, come double check what we've figured out? How do you do that?
Yeah, I think much in the same way that we acquire consultants to build our products to help us make sure that they're first viable products and they work and they're scalable and then performance and that whole thing. I think you should have a conversation with a security person in a consulting type role to help make sure that you have those building blocks in place, both for your product. And if you get a good consultant, like if that's for us, like we're building a product in the cloud, we have consultants that help us with the infrastructure part, with the building of the product part, and security is part of that conversation. It's not a separate conversation when we talk about the product.
Interesting. Okay.
In terms of internal security, it's kind of different. I mean, because we are security practitioners, I think that the risk that we're taking in terms of security of our own infrastructure today is largely betting on cloud and software as a service. And I think, I don't know, I may get flame mail for this, but I strongly believe that you should use software in the cloud, software as a service, and cloud technologies as the foundation to run your business today
Yeah,
and
here's the
accept that
distinction.
risk.
Let me just add a point to that, B2B. I'm convinced consistently B2B solutions looking at the cloud are on par, if not better at security than what most large enterprises can do. B2C, different situation.
But even
But
in your own
B2B
internal, like the software that you use to build your company, I mean, even if you're only two people that are starting a company, you're going to need technology to help you build a company, right? You're going to need.
Yeah, that's one of the stories that I grabbed too, which talks about the real cost of starting up a company, and we can go through that in a minute because I'm kind of curious what, from a security perspective, you would add to it. But I want to go back to this though, because this is one of those things that I'm starting to notice in startups. So I'll give you an example. One of the startups at an incubator locally, they had a pretty interesting product, and I'm going to keep it a little more masked, other than to say, I'm the first person who said to them, right, but what if somebody does this? What if somebody does that? Have you considered those things? And they looked at me and said, well, who would do that? Right, that was it. And I think it's a very natural reaction.
Yeah.
But then when I stood with them, I said, yeah, but think about this for a second. The problem that you're trying to solve, if somebody was bent on it, they could reverse what your solution is, right, and create a problem.
Yeah, I recently I covered an article on, well, we mentioned it briefly, home security systems, and security researchers basically tore to shreds many of the home security systems that are on the market today. So you're not a security company in our sense, but you're a physical security company if you're doing home alarm systems. So you have to take into account that someone is going to try and bypass your stuff. And it was very clear that many of these companies did not do that. And, they showed
and
by
the funny
example.
part was this one in particular, it was a product for the home. They had, here's the part that I think is kind of interesting. They actually had made some decisions that they were not going to use Wi-Fi. And there were a number of reasons, very well thought out, very customer service oriented types of thoughts. But when it came to things around, well, tell me about your chipset, right? The questions I've asked you about. Tell me about your chipset. Tell me about your updates. Tell me, right, all the stuff we've covered in episode 2. Well, they didn't have answers to that. But here's the thing. I've also been in these types of meetings with investors and with mentors who they're very excited to tell you the solution. So instead of asking the question, they say, well, you've got to use triple DES or whatever. And you look at them and you go, why would you use triple DES now? Well, because that's what you did. I don't want to suggest to startups on any side that they need that, but they need to know that there's somebody that they can ask questions of that's going to look at it objectively in their context and say, oh, that's interesting. Well, here's the top 3 that come to mind. What would you do? And I guess then, so here's the flip side. So when you're in that situation as a startup, you need to start to figure out a sounding board. But when you're looking for the sounding board, you're not necessarily looking for the expertise. So I actually like your idea, Paul, of finding somebody that you can retain. But then you've got to ask some questions about, have you worked with startups? Are you going to understand our landscape? And what I'm looking for right now are scenarios and high-level discussion, not solutions.
Right.
And that's the distinction to it. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that if we want to start to affect change positively in the industry, the startup culture is one of those things that matters. In the way that we think about and talk about security has got to come into it. And we've got more we'll do in future episodes, but looking at where attackers are actually looking for data now and what they're looking for is changing, and we need to be able to tell startups how to think about protecting themselves a little bit better, and the investors some questions to ask to make sure that they're doing that. So we'll cover that in the future.
And I think too that when you're a technology startup and you're creating some kind of technology, you're certainly building it such that it designs appropriately and reacts to environmental changes and does what it's supposed to do, right? So if you're making a TV, you're making sure that it doesn't catch fire, right? So let's say you're making a washing machine. You've probably talked about during your design making sure that it doesn't leak. But what you're maybe not taking into account is what if an attacker were to take control of our software and forces the washing machine to leak? And
That's exactly right.
so in that thinking of designing your process, you have to include security, and a trusted advisor, I think, in that respect is definitely helpful.
Yeah, and so let's stick with that, because I think that's a fantastic example. And somebody goes, well, who would do that anyway? And there's two answers. There's the person who's bent on it, and for some reason they want to take you down. But there's the other, the opportunistic. Somebody figures out that you've sold 100,000 of these units, and they can flood 100,000 homes doing this.
Exactly.
They'll do it.
Yep.
We don't have to like it, but they'll do it.
There would be a ransom associated with that too, right?
So what do you think then of this concept? And we've talked about this on Security Weekly, but so like a cyber UL, like an underwriter's laboratory.
Yeah, we totally need that. I saw that article in there, Michael, and we totally need that. We need some, just like we try to assure the consumer the safety of products to certain degrees, depending on what your product is. I mean, in some things, it's a warning label, right? In other things, there are actual standards, such as the UL. I think we need the same thing for security. I know there's efforts going on. I think that's a great thing. I hope it becomes more of a standard, and I think it will once consumers and investors are looking at that standard and holding you against it, right? And then, of course, we get into that whole debate about, well, PCI, and then are we just trying to be compliant kind of thing? That's a slippery slope. We can't go down that slope.
That's one of the things that I liked about this particular article is it said, look, we're not looking to it's not a seal of approval. It's not hack proof. In fact, that's one of the things that I think people sometimes don't always understand with UL is that you're UL listed, which doesn't always mean that you're UL tested.
Right.
There's a distinction
Yes.
between it. But what does seem to come out of that work, and what I'm optimistic about, is that it starts to give us a body to think through the standards, and that gives us the questions. I think the insurance market's going to start to play with this too. So, I look at that and I say, so if you are a security startup, you need to pay attention to these things and start thinking about it now in terms of your roadmap. Would you do this? Would you comply? Does that give you a competitive advantage? Or does that give you that social proof? Does that take away some of that risk of working with you? But then if you're a startup and you're concerned about security, and let's be clear, you need to be, this might be one of those things that helps you figure out right from wrong. But let's go to this one. So I thought this was interesting. The question is, what does a software company cost to start? And it starts out by saying, okay, look, we're going to set this apart. We're not talking about VC. We're not talking about spending OPM, right, other people's money. What we're saying is you're bootstrapping this. What do you need to do in order to do it? And I thought it was kind of interesting. There was some, because you just talked about, look, if you're building a company today, of course you're going to use the cloud. Of course you're going to do things at scale. Then there was a lot of stuff here that I thought made a lot of sense. So it talked about the skills, and what I thought was interesting was security was not listed in that at all. It talked about where you're going to go to get your servers and what type of necessities you're going to have. And with the exception of talking about SSL certificates, I didn't see security listed anywhere in here. Do you think that's a mistake, or do you think we're getting to the point where, and you can look at it. I mean, the stuff that they listed, right? I mean, they list WordPress, they list Ruby on Rails, they list some stuff that I haven't played with. They talk about going to DigitalOcean. They talk about using Heroku. Is security implied in enough of these now that it doesn't need to be a question?
No, it is certainly not baked in by default. And this is where you need to have good operations. And they actually mention operations in here. And they say it's overlooked, but the ability to keep a team moving forward with lists and action items is huge. Yeah, that's operations. But you also want to think about your IT and security operations as it applies to all of these products. We use many of these products at Security Weekly, but we have a plan and a process to make sure that, one, they're implemented securely, and that also implies integrity and reliability too, which is important if you're a startup or any company. We make sure that they're configured with security. Look at Gmail, right? I mean, if you're going to have a startup today, you're likely going to use Google Apps for Business.
Oh, absolutely.
There's so many tools in there that can be helpful to any company, and especially a startup. We started using Google Keep. Have you ever seen this?
You know what? They just re-released and updated some of it for iOS, and I was taking a look at that relative to Notes on Apple relative to Evernote. What's your take on it so far?
I really like Google Keep. I think it's great. I think it's a great way to collaborate and communicate because you can share your notes with other people on your team. So it's kind of like always being in the same room looking at the same whiteboard, which for technology startups I think is huge. But keep in mind, when you get a Google Apps for Business account, there are lots of security things that you have to go enable, such as two-factor authentication, the alerting when someone logs into your account. There's password policy. So just because you're not hosting your own email server doesn't mean that you can forget about security entirely. It's just different now. You're configuring it on someone else's servers, essentially, which is great. I think it takes away a lot of the traditional headaches with security and lets you focus in on how you want to implement it in your organization. So I think absolutely the operations piece is just a little different than what's described in this article, but every startup, every company needs to apply that.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that I would add to it, because I looked at that list and I compared it to my own list of things, and like you, I'm very comparable to the stuff that they're doing there. But I do go in, and where two-factor is allowed, I've enabled it. Where you can force, HTTPS, I've done that, although that's almost default now in most places.
Yeah.
So I think what we're saying is it's not so much that you have to look for specific software. If you're using generically popular software today, you're probably good. But it's worth, and again, it's that simple question: did we check the boxes on security?
Right.
And I would say at this point, it's not. You shouldn't have to justify doing the secure thing. It's almost the opposite. If you choose not to do two-factor, why? If you choose not to be alerted when somebody logs into your account, why? Like it's more of a, you need to be prepared to explain why you didn't take that path, as opposed to why you did or you didn't take that path.
No, I completely agree. Where to next, Michael?
Let's talk about, because I'm curious your take on this. So the one, how do founders decide who takes the lead? So what I think is interesting about this is when we look at, this is something we talked about in the last episode, and we touched on in the first episode. What gets you where you are may not be what gets you where you need to go. And one of the things that's interesting is that there's a lot of people who come from a corporate world and then they're in a startup world and they find it's different. It's not what we expected, right? We talked about the importance of sales and process and other stuff. Well, so when you're a company and you put it together, well who takes the lead? But then I'm going to take it a step further because we are looking at security. So in your case, I'm curious, to the extent you're comfortable talking about it, you guys are a security startup. You're all hardened practitioners. So when it comes to taking the lead on security, how did you guys handle that?
Yeah, so there's one thing in this article that says play to your strengths, and I think that the whole article could really just be that. And we all, inside of security, have strengths that apply to specific pieces of security that are all different. So if someone's really good at cloud security, that's their role, is cloud security. If someone's really good at software and code security, that's what you do. If someone's really good at operational security and configuring all these, cloud hosting things, that's what you do. So you find where people's strengths are within security, and you get them to focus on just those areas. So I think the whole thing is.
Are you the coordinator of that?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to. I mean, when you run your own company, you can't.
In your environment, you're that guy, right? So you're the one who's coordinating all those different things.
Yeah. So the people who are building the systems take direction from me, and I make sure that they're building it securely, learning where their strengths are, and assigning them tasks to help with tasks that are aligned with their strengths.
No, that makes sense. All right. So what advice would you then give to a startup who says, okay, security, what do we do with it? Do you automatically give that to the most technical person? Do you give it to the coder? Do you give it to somebody who might have a network background? Or do you give it to somebody who's less experienced and more likely to ask more questions?
I think it depends on that person's strength, not necessarily their experience. And if you're mixing experienced and non-experienced people, learn how to group them into teams, right? Take the experienced developer who knows how to write secure software, take the new person who may be writing your interface or whatever, and pair those people together so that that person learns how to code securely.
Oh, I like that. I would say, and I'm curious your take on this, is that if I was in a startup today, even if it was a two-person startup, I'd make sure somebody had security as a responsibility.
Yeah.
And you know, look, we've said for years, if you make it a collateral duty, it won't ever happen. I appreciate in startup things move fast. So, okay, it's a collateral duty, but then I would allocate some time to it every week, and I would make sure you had some conversations about that. But I want one person on point. And what I would offer is, sign up for some of the alerts, you know, listen to this show, of course, but other types of podcasts or read some of the blogs and just kind of keep your pulse on things, your finger on the pulse of things. So if something comes up, you can bring the team together and have that conversation. To me, that feels like a pretty minimum set of requirements to just kind of focus on keeping security as part of your startup.
Yeah, I agree. That's the best advice right there. Keep security as part of your startup.
All right, let's talk about, I thought this was interesting. 7 rockstar female founders share their best startup advice. And the one that I liked the most, which wouldn't shock you, is to know your why. It's understanding why you do what you do. I'll tell you, because we'll keep coming back and we'll talk about some of the Straight Talk framework stuff in some of the episodes here. But it's fascinating the number of times that I would say to somebody who pitches me, startup or otherwise, security or otherwise, why do you do it? The answer can't be the money. I mean, it's fine if you're motivated by money. I have no problem with that. But if you want to come into my enterprise or you want to go into some organization and you want to make a difference, why? And I'm always curious with the how. Like, how did you come up with this thing? What drives you? Why are you doing what you're doing? And it's fascinating the number of people that either haven't really stopped to think about it, or they really stumble to articulate it. And when I read this list, that popped right out because we buy from people. When you're a startup, especially if you're a security startup, and you're trying to penetrate and you want to get to somebody who's excited about this, it's going to be an emotional connection. That's going to come from knowing your why.
And I think I'll build upon that, Michael, and I'll take a page out of your leadership book, right? Is not only do you have to know why and be able to explain why to other people, but everyone who's working for or with your startup has to understand the why.
Oh, completely agree with you.
You as the leader have to be able to communicate that to other people well enough so that they can communicate it to the outside world.
Yeah, consistently. Here's the thing that I find fascinating is that if you're not consistent, you create dissonance, and dissonance creates delays. So if you get to that place where I've heard 3 different stories and they don't necessarily jive, I might still be interested in your solution, but I'm probably going to slow things down until I can figure it out. And, you know, P.S., I've got 15 other things on my docket, so I'll get around to it. But like when you're looking at a startup and you're like, I thought we were really going well, and now things started slowing down. You know, definitely look at your communication and look at if you created confusion in that. The other thing I like, because this has been mine lately, is done is better than perfect.
Yeah, I'm kind of on the fence on that one.
Well,
I guess because I'm a perfectionist.
Yeah, well, I mean, my own self, what I've come to understand, I use slightly different language, is it's not so much that I'm interested in perfection as I'm interested in mastery. And there's a subtlety of that because I know there's no perfect. But what I have started to realize is that, so I am curious your take on this. In the world in which I work, right, where I try to teach people how to do some of this stuff better, is if you just get your first iteration out, right, what we would call it in writing is cover the canvas or painting, right? And it's interesting because I've talked to sculptors about this. I'm going to just a quick tangent. And I say, you know, what's the hardest part? They go, just start. Just get it started.
Yeah.
Just get the clay up on the wheel, get the clay up on the whatever.
I saw a great quote because we're doing some construction here in the studio, and it said that the road to success is always under construction. And
I like that.
That's kind of how I would answer this question, and I think that the road to perfection, right, is always under construction. But what you need to realize is that when you make decisions, and yeah, it might not quite be ready yet, make it easy for yourself to reach your goals of perfection or success or whatever you're defining. I think a lot of people will take that as, done is better than perfect, as, well, I'll just do this quick thing here, and then 6 months down the road, they're like, oh my God, we have to go repave the whole friggin' road again to go forward again.
It's the distinction between taking shortcuts that aren't shortcuts,
Yes,
and moving and iterating quickly to say, okay, I see this vision where I can give you 15 options, but I'm going to start with 3.
right, and that's a lot of my role as CEO. That's what I do, right? I'm like, we need to get here. And they're like, holy crap, yeah, no, we're not ready for that yet. And I'm like, all right, so what are we going to do to get there? And like, well, we're going to do this. And I'm like, okay, well, if you do that, does that make it easy to get closer to our goal? And they're like, well, yeah, it's we're building towards that. Or sometimes they're like, well, no, yeah, we're going to go down a path and we're going to scrap that idea. So I think as a leader, one of the things I've realized is that I have to make some concessions about, okay, we got to get to market, we got to get things done, but make sure that we're building things smart so that we can reach those goals that you have as a CEO.
Yeah, let's build on this. There's I threw this one in to talk on the leadership side to it. It was, and then this is back from May, and I think Harvard Business Review does a pretty good job with this stuff. So this is one of their stories, and it talks about listening as an overlooked leadership tool. But those two concepts go hand in hand. One of the things that I'm learning is I can sit around and try to design what I think is the optimum way to do something, and I maybe I'll be right. But what I'm starting to realize is a better pathway, at least in the way that I'm developing stuff, is to get a group of people together sooner rather than later. And what I'm starting to notice too is at the moment when I think, okay, I'm almost close, that's the moment to go. I don't feel ready. I'm unsettled with it. I got too many questions. My brain is popping in 17 different directions. That's the time to go. Because I'm not really ready to go. That's the time to go. And I can show people what it is. I can let them have an experience. I can listen to their questions. And that's the key. I think this talks about listening as a leadership tool, and I love questions. I mean, gosh, if nothing else, I love questions. But what and the thing I would add to this particular article is and I'm curious your take on this and how you do with this. I love to listen fully, and then instead of sometimes just asking more questions, I like to think about what wasn't asked or what wasn't said. Like in my mind, I reach some conclusion, and so I've gotten very comfortable in my life at saying, it's funny, I didn't hear you ask about this. Why? And sometimes there's a really good reason. They're like, oh, because da 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 da. You're like, oh, okay, cool. And sometimes that was absolutely the right question. So when you ask questions and when you listen, how do you handle it?
I don't know there's any particular strategy. I think that my advice would be to break it up into smaller chunks, right? So that you can think of those things. So we have a daily 15-minute stand-up meeting for the startup. And I think that's where if you forgot to ask a question the day before, there's always a meeting the next day. And having a meeting that short makes you really think about the pointed questions, right, that you have for that day. Like what needs to be accomplished for that day, right? And you don't want to overload them for a single day. So it kind of helps you spread it out. I think it's a really effective tool. So that's kind of my non-answer to that question, Michael.
Well, yeah, and I said something too the other day. It said asking why leads to understanding, asking why not leads to innovation. I think it's good, but one of the things that I've realized is the power of questions is something that's often overlooked. And so when you're in that startup mode, it's the other thing I've learned too. So I'm comfortable pushing back on clients. In fact, right, I would describe myself largely now as an advisor. And the distinction is, right, contractor, you've got a pile of rocks. They show up, you give them money, they bring a shovel, they move the rocks. A consultant's going to come in and they're going to talk about the optimum way to move and place the rocks and how they're going to disturb the least amount of whatever. And it's a fantastic experience. The advisor walks up and says, so why are you moving the rocks?
Yeah, or what do you want the wall to look like when you're done?
Right.
Right?
It's trying to understand at that deeper level. So part of what I like about this listening and an active listening and these asking of questions is if you're a startup and you're really excited about this idea or this feature set and you come back to me and you go, okay, client says they need X, you better be able to explain why. And even if you hear it from 10 clients, 10 clients come back and they say, okay, we really want X, then at some level you need to go back to them and say, okay, cool, yeah, I think we can build that in, or oh, we'll explore that, right? There's plenty of language tricks to do that, but then but go further and say, well, help me understand how you're doing that, or why that would help for you, and so like when you do your listing, don't just try to get to the answer, try to also understand the answer or that experience, and always look for those contexts, because you might find, and in fact I've been thinking about this a lot relative to some of our conversations. I think there's a delicate balance between leading the market and responding to the market. You get too far out ahead of it, right? There's a curve. You get too far out ahead of that curve, nobody wants to take that risk, right? But most people want to be right on the edge of that curve.
Yeah, and that's where I'm at now with software as a service adoption. It's kind of it drives me insane, to be honest with you, but as it stands today, you got to listen to the market, and if they want to have it on premise, you got to deliver on premise. Now, I like to push people towards the cloud, but there's pushback. So, I don't know where we are on that technology, Michael, and I'm sure it depends on the situation and what solutions you're providing. But that's an interesting dynamic, is the in business to business, where the line is between cloud application and on-premise.
Yeah, because you're right. I mean, you could say, look, we're going to go cloud. We're only cloud. And, oh, you don't like that? I'm sorry. We're cloud only. And you get absolutely no traction at all. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't work. And that's not good as a startup. So it's like I said, it's interesting because you want to be responsive to people, but you also want to try to lead them. What do you think then of Brad Feld? I mean, a lot of people are big Brad Feld fans. And one of the things that he's been doing for a while is very candid, very open, very authentic writing. And he wrote about something back in May that has really captured me. Now, just to be fair, I'm a big fan of incubation. I love the idea of, like you said, ask the question today, think on it tonight, get the answer tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Like I love spacing some stuff out and figuring it out as you go. So he talks about try the decision on for 30 days. And then he goes and he actually describes the way that he does it is, like he was thinking about leaving or doing something different or working in a different capacity. Well, give yourself like an hour in the morning to think about it and an hour in the evening and journal it or write about it and really visualize it. I think that's interesting, but I want to kind of point it back to you, because what I'm curious is, do you think that any of your clients that are on-prem, could you convince them to do a 30-day trial of something in the cloud with non-sensitive data?
Yeah,
like same concepts?
I think of the corporations out there today, or organizations that have that really stringent policy of no solutions to be deployed in the cloud, you might not be able to convince them if they have a strict policy. However, a lot of them do have a process, or basically a decision, like you're saying, a decision-making process that allows them to potentially adopt something in the cloud. And those people in that situation, I think you do have an opportunity to explain the benefits, explain the risk, and help them make an informed decision. And I mean, let's be faced, there are going to be companies that aren't going to want this in the cloud, in the public cloud. So,
and I appreciate too. Once we get to security stuff, I just took a briefing with a company that I really enjoyed, and by the way, they said 30 days is enough time for them to gather the data to make better decisions. Oh, there you go. So What I really liked about Brad's advice here is try the decision on. So again, I think that this works for you inside the organization. I think this works for you when you're selling to somebody. Take a spin for 30 days. But here's the piece I would add to it then. Be active with it too. It's not just, okay, kick the tires, okay, do this, okay. It's a way to think about stuff differently and to say, all right, give yourself a time limit. I used to tell people, just do it for 2 weeks. Do something for 2 weeks. You can do anything for 2 weeks, right? Mentally, we can see this week, we can see next week. You can do anything for 2 weeks. Try it out, see how it works, right? And that goes back to that done is better than perfect.
Right.
Get it done. Try it for 2 weeks. To your point, don't branch it with these shoddy shortcuts that are going to shoot you in the foot, right? Or as I like to say, it's okay to shoot yourself in the foot, just don't reload. Right? So exactly. Be afraid to make those mistakes. Be afraid to take, don't be afraid to take that risk. Try it out, but try it out short snippets, short bites, see what works, iterate, move on from there.
What is this article? I like this one about your content marketing strategy doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah, this is, and I tell you, this really spoke to me. I figured some stuff out this week, and just trying to take a look at it. Its basic point is, and I'm going to take a little bit of my stuff on it, right? So one of the things is that we keep telling everybody content matters. In fact, this word opens with, we're constantly being told content is king. The thing is, I would argue, if content is the king, context is the queen. And you bow to the queen. The context is really what matters. That might be a different conversation. But what I liked about this is this concept of content marketing has really taken off in the last 5 or 6 years. And in that, the idea is that everybody's a publisher, everybody's got content to put out there. But what I think is interesting then is that it's really easy to kind of miss the point of what it is that you're trying to get accomplished. And so I watch people do one of two things. They get exceptionally rigid as a startup. I will do this on this date. And when you look at it and say, what was the value? There wasn't one. Did you have any context? No. Did that help you make any differences? No. Or they kind of don't, they just ad hoc it all. So what this point is saying is, you can't do more content. You got to do the right content.
Right.
And so the question then is, well, how do you do that? And so what this lays out is, in fact, I love this. I'll quote from this. It was Rudyard Kipling's 1902 poem, The Elephant's Child. And the quote is, I keep 6 honest serving men. They taught me all I knew. Their names are what and why and when and how and where and who. And his point was, use that to start your campaign. Answer those questions. Focus on the why, the who. You've got a solid foundation. And then you can go through and you can answer these other types of questions. And I think it's a really good advice, is that you need a balance of strategy, but it doesn't need to be overly complex. So if you're in that startup phase, especially if you're a security startup and you're trying to explain these types of things and you're trying to explain them carefully, start with why. Give us the origin story.
It's so funny to hear you say that, Michael, because we do a technical segment on the Security Weekly show, and I always start with the why. Like, why did I do this? Why would you want to do this? What's the context behind it? And so often I see content that it's like, wow, that's really cool, but there was no why or context around it. And I think like you said, you can only create so much content. You have to create the right content, and understanding the why and targeting an audience is a really good idea.
Yeah, and that's the who, right? I mean, and we've talked about this before. I'll tell you, one of the things that's interesting, since I do a lot of work with communicators, is I'll have somebody come up to me after a keynote and they'll say, so how'd I do? And I always ask him, do you want me to talk about your platform mechanics and your voice and your slides? Or do you want to talk about the substance? And if you want to talk about the substance, here's my simplest question. Now that I've given you 30, 45, 60 minutes of my life, what should I do differently? Why did you share that with me today? Number one answer I get is, I don't know. And that's not the right answer.
Well, you know what else drives me nuts too, Michael, and I'm going to get up my soapbox, is we run, I guess our website's pretty popular, right? So we get all these requests from sometimes directly from the company, sometimes the public relations company. It's like, hey, we wrote this article on, I don't know, FISMA compliance, and we want to post it on your website. Like, what are you doing? What? First of all, what's my incentive? Like, you have no idea. You obviously have no idea who my audience is, and you're just coming to me with this content. And again, this goes back to people, I think, doing content marketing wrong. They're just creating globs of content.
No,
and
that's exactly
where do I want to put it? Oh, I found this website, so we need to put it there. And are you going to pay me for that? No.
And they look at it too, and they go, well, and we want links, and we want backlinks, and this will raise our profile, and it doesn't. So the other part to this too, I think, is which matters is the who. Who do we serve? You and I've talked about this a lot, and we're going to keep talking about it. If your answer is everybody,
right,
you probably serve nobody.
Yeah.
And you don't be afraid to tell us who you serve. Don't be afraid. And if you don't know, I mean, I have to tell you, I've been struggling with that myself, because I work with startups, I work with investors, I work with executives, I work with solution providers. But mostly I serve security people that are looking to elevate their leadership and their communication. Now, because I'm focusing on bringing people together, I do work with those other groups. And so what I'm working on now is putting together those stories and showing and giving people that social proof and explaining it. But what I've been through on my own journey as a startup looking at this is, my 80% audience, my people, our security people
Right.
that are recognized for their technical talent, and they're not really thought of as leaders. I mean, they're called leaders because they're technical people with a team, but that's leadership by designation, not leadership by action. And they want that. They
The
want
other the other thing too is that happens kind of on the flip side is people companies will go to a person and say, I want you to write a post for our blog. And a lot of times, Michael, that whole contextual why is left out.
Yeah.
And the who gets, who you're trying to target gets mixed up too.
In fact, what I would say is the big mistake I see people make, especially in the security space, is we want that gone. We think we should stomp that out and let it all ride on its merits. Just explain how it works, and it'll take care of itself. And so I guess what we're both telling people is, no, don't do that. Go ahead, tell me the why. Tell me what caught your attention. Tell me what caught your fancy. And I've seen as my own writing has shifted, when I give people their voice and I give them that chance to answer those questions or to think that stuff through, it's more entertaining, it's more compelling, it's more interesting. Those are the things that we watch and that we respond to. And so, so the point to it was, if you're in that startup mode, you don't need to hire a content marketing manager necessarily. You don't need to have all these different types of things. I'll tell you, one of the things that I did recently was I had just done one of my workshops, and I came back and I wrote down all the questions that I got asked that I really liked. And I went, okay, I've got like 10 blog posts, things I can go write about. But then I started thinking about, well, what's the priority? And by the way, I've paralyzed myself because then I went, well, I've got like 3 lists now of 10 things on them. Where do I start?
Well,
and the answer is, right, just start.
And here's the thing, you're doing it right, Michael, when it comes to content marketing, is you're putting yourself in different venues and distributing it differently and having it build upon each other. You're going to give a workshop or a talk and then say, oh, by the way, I have a blog, and then you're writing to the audience that is going to come to your blog, and then you're integrating that with social media. You got to do all those things. You can't just say, well, our content marketing strategy is we're going to write blog posts about our product space.
Yeah, we're going to get everybody really excited about it. I'll tell you what, too, then, from a security perspective, one of the things that I've learned in the last 5 days, and I'm actually really excited about it, was what I figured out, and it's just taken me a couple months of really looking at this, is, like, for example, if you want to learn about Straight Talk, in fact, I had an epiphany last night. There's the Straight Talk framework. I'm happy to give that away. And then there's a Straight Talk program, and that's where I go and I work with people and I show them how to apply it to achieve their goals and elevate their leadership. Okay, big breakthrough for me. There's a distinction. There's a framework. I give you that.
Right.
And then there's the how to use it and how to achieve your goals with it. And that's what hopefully people will pay me for, and I'll help elevate them on that path. Well, once I figured that out, I went, oh, so then I can do talks and webinars, and I can bring you back to my website to give you the free stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by the way, I will show you how to use it. In fact, I'm coming up with an idea now. In fact, I might talk with you about it, off show about some thoughts. But the point is, what starts to happen when you at least think about those questions, and then the questions that the people that you serve have, and you answer those questions for them, you can give away, right, a lot of your value and explain stuff to people so they feel very comfortable buying with you. You make it
you're earning their trust. Absolutely.
Decision.
Yep.
What I would say too with content marketing is I see a lot of people like, well, but if I tell them, then they won't need me. Newsflash. If you don't tell them, they still won't need you.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, but look, security tends to operate from a scarcity mindset, and that's fine. It's not a judgment on my part. It's the way that we're bent. We look at the downside of risk. That's where we spend our time, looking at the bad things that happen. But what I would argue for you is, in the startup world, especially as a security startup, give it away. I don't mean give your product away. Give your insight away. Give your lessons away. Give the things that you figured away, because as an industry, we'll be collectively better for it. And as that happens, people will right. There's a law of attraction, and there's a law of reciprocity. There's a lot of psychology behind it. But if we get past all that, what I find is you can't help everybody. Not everybody is going to be a customer. If you can help more people by giving some of your ideas and insights away, great. Now, secret sauce, stuff that would let a competitor beat you, no.
Right.
That's yours. Keep that. That's fine. But
so, Michael, what's this business about using IoT to understand how your products perform?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is, I think we're probably not going to really have a show where we don't talk about IoT. And the idea behind this was, it basically said, okay, here's an idea for IoT, use it. And it gives an example of checking on a coffee pot. And its point was, you should start looking about IoT, and really it was breaking it down into sensors and signals to figure out when something isn't performing properly, or and to alert both you and or the customer so that their experience is better. And to me, it's a little bit like the gas gauge, or if you've got a newer vehicle, it'll tell you the percentage of oil life that you have left, or it'll remind you when it's time for maintenance, and it'll tell you based on sensor feedback which things you need to have. And so they're saying, hey, this is an interesting way that you can help other people not miss out on your product. Because, the argument was, well, if the coffee maker stops working, they're not going to wait a week for the replacement. They're just going to go out and buy a new coffee maker.
Right.
But if you had warned them ahead of time, then you're more likely to keep them as a customer. And I thought that's kind of novel. But now, how much data are we getting? I mean, go back to your point too. What if somebody tweaks the sensor? What does that do? And so I kind of look at it as going, so on one hand, are people going to pay attention to it? Right? I mean, I don't know how many people I don't know how many people wait till the little gauge says E and the little light comes on to tell you to put fuel in your vehicle. But we have those, and do they work? Are they ignored? I know people, when the check engine light comes on, the check engine, right? So there's a check engine and stop engine. Check engine light comes on, they'll stop. That's an overreaction, right? So how do you calibrate that? But I looked at it and I said, well, so are there security considerations? Do I need to protect that data? Do I need to protect those transmissions? I mean, does every transmission need to be secured? And so if we start saying, hey, look at all these ideas, at some point that data becomes valuable. And I'm always curious about it. So what's your take on this? You like that idea of saying, let's Internet of Things everything?
Yeah, well, it has interesting privacy implications. If you read Daniel Suarez's book, Freedom TM, talks about that a lot. How
fascinating
everything, once we move to devices being everywhere and everything being connected, how that can lead to a loss of privacy. Now, I think we're a ways away from that, and I think largely it's due to the differences in consumers that we have today. And I think very much so consumers largely today, I think, fall in the I don't care. I'm going to go buy the cheapest Wi-Fi, the cheapest washing machine, dishwasher, whatever. And today, that's not going to have those interconnected features. But as we move forward in time, you're not going to be able to buy a home appliance or anything for your home that isn't internet connected. Now,
that's a great point.
Today, my example is I put out there on Twitter what people do for Wi-Fi in their homes based on my Twitter followers, right? And I got everything from I build my own Linux devices and use Host AP, open source Linux software, and do it all myself, which is cool. That's awesome. All the way to, I use the $500 commercial solution for the home, and everything in between. A lot of people talked about companies that we all know and maybe even love or hate, but Aruba, Meraki, Ubiquiti were all mentioned in that mixture. And I was speaking to someone yesterday who said, hey, I live near this other person who we know in the same apartment complex, and he moved to another level below, and he was letting me use his Wi-Fi. And I put this range extender that I bought for $30, and I can get it at my front door, but I can't get it inside my apartment. So this is the consumers that we're dealing with, right? All don't want the solutions that are $500 for Wi-Fi. They don't want to pay for internet. They want to get it free from someone else. So I think we've got some time before we really realize some of those privacy concerns, but absolutely they're there. We're already seeing them today. If you have a smartphone, Google knows your location based on what Wi-Fi access points are around.
Now, this article breaks down 4 elements, and I'm going to run through the high level of it. Let me give you all 4, and I want your opinion on it. I like 3s and 5s, so 4 is always going to make me feel a little awkward. But here's their point, and again, their idea is they want to get to what they call the truth on product performance. So what they're saying is, here's our chance. You're going to sell devices that are Internet of Things enabled, or that are somehow using this concept, this categorization, that you're going to be reporting back on usage and health and all sorts of other stuff. And at some level, just to be clear, I like it because we know if you ask somebody did you like that? Oh yeah, I loved it. You don't know if they liked it or not. It's kind of like, if a company gets breached, will you ever shop there again? Oh, absolutely not.
And then
They're totally going to shop
a
there,
week
right?
goes by, and then
So what they're saying here is you're going to have the data. So here's their 4 things. First, you have to have the customer agree to have the product monitored, which means you have to give them something of value in return.
yeah.
And this is where I think the security comes in most. I mean, what they basically said is, look, I can give you a cost savings, I can give you a higher premium, I can give you something else. But now they're talking about, these sensors transmitting medical information or metadata about medical information. And I think if we've learned anything from the security marketplace is you could fingerprint just about everything these days.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to really the 2 issues where this goes, right? I think the consumer will be willing to give up some information in exchange for something that benefits them.
I think we've already been.
That's proven, right? I mean,
By the
if I get a discount, I'm gonna fill out the survey or.
This is the thing that fascinated me. This happened 20 years ago. Accenture had a group. This was back they were still Andersen Consulting, and they started saying to people, to consumers, right? And this is right before we really started having smartphones. But they said, hey, if you have this sensor, and I can determine that you're by my store, and I've got the sweater that you wanted in stock
on sale, yeah,
give you a discount. Is that interesting to you? And overwhelmingly 20 years ago, people said yes. And we'd say, but that means you're going to disclose your location and you're going to connect with this thing. And they went, yeah, that's fine. I don't care.
But I think where the issue gets sticky is who they share that data with.
That's exactly right.
And that's the advice that I have for companies today. They come to me, they're like, oh, we're going to collect this data. How do we secure it? How do we store it? And that kind of thing from a technology perspective. And they're very clear about how they share it. And that's one of the things I make them talk about with me is who are you going to share it with and how are you going to communicate that to the customer? Because I think the real privacy concerns are now other people know that I bought that sweater and it ties, I don't know, into my credit rating or my mortgage, or if it starts to have negative effects
to show where you were at different times.
Yes.
You can map out where you go, where you shop, what your
where
what your
it
likes
starts to
are.
have negative consequences for me, that's when people
Now,
get cheated.
Let me point out another piece of this that I think is interesting. There was a big uproar, if you remember, when Radio Shack filed for their bankruptcy, because they had said for years, look, we're not going to sell our customer lists. And the bankruptcy court said, no, you certainly are.
You have to.
That's an asset.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, well, but we have a privacy policy. But they said, right, okay, so hi, you're in bankruptcy, and that's an asset, and we are going to dissolve that asset. So that means then that we have to be willing to engage in that level of conversation in our industry and realize that as IoT, if you're going to gather that type of information and you're going to store it for any length of time, it may at some point in your future be considered an asset. Right. And I get it. Some people are sitting there going, I know, and it's going to work.
Yeah.
And some people aren't. All right, here's the second part. And these are more interesting internally. Product performance data must be processed and acted upon quickly. Now, I think it's interesting. I think the security consideration there is that means you're ripe for disruption. And I'll be curious to see how that plays out. A culture that accepts the truth, however bad. And the fourth one is reimagining the business must become the mantra. So their idea is I'm going to get you better information faster, and you're going to have to shift your culture to deal with it and whatever else. But I think what we've looked at from a security perspective is if I know a company is doing something like that and I'm a dishonest competitor, I might look for ways to disrupt that or otherwise modify that data.
I think along these lines, check out our interview with Cory Doctorow on the Security Weekly show. It was great.
Absolutely.
And check out his works. They definitely play into this subject area. Unfortunately, Michael, we're at the end of our time today.
Yes, it's the end. But people are better.
That's right. And that was episode 3 of Startup Security